The biggest mistake powerful people make isn't underestimating talent, it's assuming talent always wears an expensive suit. At exactly 7:12 on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, every table at Hawthorne and Ash was occupied except one, the corner booth reserved every week for the man whose signature could move markets before sunrise. The crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of antique chandeliers while the windows trembled beneath the steady rhythm of spring rain. Conversations drifted through the restaurant like carefully rehearsed performances, interrupted only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant hiss of the espresso machine. Clara Bennett carried a tray balanced effortlessly on one hand, weaving through the crowded dining room with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the loudest people usually notice the least. At 27, she had worked enough double shifts to recognize the difference between wealth and confidence, between influence and wisdom. They rarely arrived together. Her black apron was spotless despite 6 relentless hours on her feet. A tiny notebook rested inside its pocket, hidden beneath folded guest checks and a blue pen with fading ink. No one had ever asked why she carried it everywhere. No one imagined the pages contained sketches of supply chains, customer behavior, pricing models, and observations she collected between coffee refills and dinner specials. Most customers remembered Clara because she never wrote down their orders. They assumed she had a good memory. They never realized she was studying patterns instead of menus. When the front doors opened, conversations softened almost instantly. Ethan Whitmore entered without looking around. He didn't need to. People always noticed him first. His charcoal overcoat carried droplets of rain that disappeared as an assistant quietly accepted it before Ethan reached the private dining room. At 39, he had built Whitmore Holdings into one of the fastest-growing investment firms in America, and every business magazine seemed determined to place his face on another cover beside another impossible headline. He wore a Swiss watch that caught the light only. When he checked the time, which happened often enough to remind everyone that his minutes were valuable. Four executives followed him inside the private room, each carrying tablets filled with presentations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Clara approached with fresh coffee before anyone asked. Ethan barely looked up. "Black," he said. "No sugar." She nodded. He always ordered the same thing. Across the table, a young executive began presenting an expansion strategy involving premium neighborhood cafes across the Midwest. Charts appeared on glowing screens. Revenue forecasts climbed confidently upward. Store counts doubled. Margins expanded. Everyone around the table nodded with practiced certainty. Clara poured coffee quietly, placing each cup with the precision of someone who respected silence. As she turned to leave, one sentence drifted toward her through the half-open door. "Customers don't stay loyal anymore," one executive declared. "Price wins every time." Clara paused for less than a second. Her eyes moved toward the presentation. A familiar map flashed across the screen. Distribution routes. Delivery schedules. Lease locations. Something felt wrong immediately. Not because the numbers were unrealistic. Because they ignored people entirely. She continued walking until she reached the service station, but the idea refused to leave her mind. She stared at a cooling cup of coffee someone had forgotten to drink. Then she quietly opened the notebook inside her apron. 3 quick circles. 2 arrows. 1 sentence. She closed it again. 15 minutes later, the meeting paused while dessert was served. Clara stepped inside carrying warm apple tarts. One executive frowned at a spreadsheet. "We can't explain why customer retention drops after 90 days, he muttered. Before Clara could stop herself, the answer escaped almost as softly as her footsteps. Because they're measuring transactions instead of trust. The room froze. Forks stopped moving. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes for the first time that evening and looked directly at the waitress standing beside the table. No one spoke. Clara immediately realized every face in the room had turned toward her. She should have apologized. She should have walked away. Instead, she simply held the tray steady and added, "People return because someone remembers them, not because something is discounted." Silence stretched across the room like the rain pressing against the windows. Then someone laughed. Another joined in. Within seconds, the entire table was smiling. Ethan leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and let out a quiet, amused chuckle that carried farther than anyone else's. "That's an interesting philosophy," he said calmly. "Tell me, does it come with quarterly earnings projections too?" More laughter filled the room. Clara met his eyes without embarrassment or anger. She simply nodded once, placed the final dessert on the table, and answered with a voice so calm it almost disappeared beneath the sound of falling rain. "No, sir. But it usually comes before them." Clara left the private dining room without changing the expression on her face. The laughter stayed behind her, blending into the soft jazz floating across hawthorn and ash, but it followed her just the same. She had learned years ago that embarrassment only lingered if you carried it yourself. The rain outside continued tracing silver lines down the tall windows while she returned to polishing wine glasses beneath the warm kitchen lights. Her breathing never changed. Her hands never trembled. Only the tiny notebook inside her apron felt a little heavier than before. Across the restaurant, Ethan Whitmore picked up his coffee again. It had already gone lukewarm. He took a sip anyway, more distracted than he cared to admit. One of the executives resumed the presentation, pointing toward another colorful chart projected onto the wall. Market share. Expansion costs. Quarterly forecasts. The conversation returned to familiar territory, but Ethan noticed something unusual. Nobody challenged the assumption Clara had questioned. They simply continued building arguments on top of it as if her comment had never existed. He glanced briefly toward the dining room. She was helping an elderly couple fold leftovers into neat paper containers, smiling politely as the husband searched every pocket for his reading glasses. Before either of them realized where they were, Clara quietly reached beneath the menu, handed the glasses back to him, and wished them a pleasant evening. She had noticed them 20 minutes earlier when he absent-mindedly tucked them beside the dessert menu. She never made him feel embarrassed for forgetting. Ethan looked away before anyone caught him watching. The meeting stretched another 40 minutes. Investors debated branding strategies. Consultants discussed automation. Someone proposed reducing staff training to improve margins. Every suggestion sounded polished. Every sentence felt expensive. Yet something about the room suddenly seemed strangely hollow. Near the kitchen entrance, the restaurant manager approached Clara with hurried steps. His smile was polite until he reached her. Then it disappeared. "My office. Now." She nodded without asking why. Inside the small office behind the pantry shelves, framed employee awards hung beside outdated health inspection certificates. The manager closed the door gently. "Do you understand what happened in there?" Clara answered honestly. "I spoke when I should not have. You challenged the most important customer this restaurant has." He rubbed his forehead before lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea how much business his company brings us every year?" Clara remained quiet. If Mr. Whitmore had taken offense, every employee here could have paid the price. She looked toward the floor for only a second before meeting his eyes again. "I understand." The manager sighed. He had expected excuses. Instead he found calm acceptance. Somehow that made the conversation harder. "I need you to apologize before they leave." Clara nodded once. "Of course." 10 minutes later, the meeting finally concluded. Chairs slid backward across polished hardwood. Jackets were buttoned. Tablets disappeared into leather briefcases. The executives laughed again while discussing flights, conferences, and golf invitations. Clara waited near the entrance with quiet patience. As Ethan approached, she offered a respectful smile. "Mr. Whitmore." He stopped. The executives slowed behind him. The entire lobby seemed to pause. With them. I wanted to apologize for interrupting your meeting. Ethan studied her face. There was no resentment. No fear. No attempt to defend herself. Just simple professionalism. You are apologizing because you were wrong, he asked. Clara shook her head gently. No, sir. That answer caught everyone by surprise. She continued before anyone could react. I am apologizing because it was not my place to interrupt your meeting. Those are two different things. The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble beneath their feet. One executive let out a short laugh. She still thinks she was right. Ethan's expression barely changed. Confidence is admirable, he said evenly, adjusting the cuff beneath his watch. Experience is usually more valuable. Clara smiled, not because she agreed, but because she had heard similar sentences before. Sometimes they arrive in different orders. Another executive rolled his eyes. Everyone has business advice these days. Clara simply stepped aside and opened the front door for them. Cool evening air drifted inside carrying the scent of rain and fresh pavement. Ethan paused for one brief moment before walking past her. For your sake, he said calmly, I hope serving tables remains more profitable than giving investment advice. Then he disappeared into the waiting black sedan. The convoy pulled away from the curb one vehicle after another until only reflections of red taillights shimmered across the wet street. Clara stood beneath the restaurant awning for another few seconds, listening to the rain. She reached into her apron, removed the tiny notebook, and carefully wrote a single sentence beneath the sketches she had made earlier that evening. Never confuse authority with accuracy. She closed the notebook, slipped it back into her pocket, and walked toward the employee parking lot without realizing that 3 blocks away, inside the back seat of his car, Ethan Whitmore stared through rain-covered glass at the city lights while one unexpected sentence refused to leave his mind. Because they are measuring transactions instead of trust. 3 months passed with remarkable indifference from the outside. Summer replaced spring. The rain gave way to bright mornings and humid evenings, and Hawthorne and Ash remained exactly what it had always been, a place where wealthy people discussed tomorrow while someone else quietly carried today's coffee. Clara Bennett never mentioned Ethan Whitmore again. She simply kept arriving 20 minutes before every shift, tying on the same black apron, greeting the kitchen staff by name, and slipping her weathered notebook into its familiar pocket. Every night after closing, long after the dining room lights had dimmed and the last dishwasher had gone home, she walked 3 blocks to a small 24-hour coffee shop with cracked leather booths and a flickering neon sign that buzzed softly against the darkness. The waitress there knew her order before she sat down. 1 black coffee. 1 glass of ice water. Nothing else. Clara opened the notebook and continued building a company no one else could see. She was not writing dreams. She was solving problems. Every page became another piece of an invisible machine. Customer retention. Employee ownership. Local supplier partnerships. Personalized rewards that felt like gratitude instead of marketing. She studied why people returned to places that remembered them and quietly ignored businesses that only remembered their wallets. Sometimes she watched families enter the diner. She noticed which servers recognized children by name. She noticed how often regular customers ordered the same meal. She noticed that loyalty was never purchased. It was earned one conversation at a time. Across the city, Whitmore Holdings moved ahead with its ambitious expansion exactly as planned. Construction crews renovated locations across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Investors praised the aggressive strategy. Business magazines celebrated Ethan's confidence. Financial television hosts described the project as another inevitable success. During quarterly meetings, executives applauded colorful graphs projecting endless growth. Nobody mentioned the waitress anymore. Nobody except Ethan. Once or twice, while reviewing presentations late into the evening, he found himself pausing whenever retention numbers appeared on the screen. The sentence returned without invitation. They are measuring transactions instead of trust. He dismissed it each time. Successful companies were built with data, not observations from restaurant employees. Still, the words lingered longer than he wanted to admit. By early September, the first warning signs appeared. They were almost invisible. Customer visits declined slightly after the opening promotions expired. Satisfaction surveys remained positive, yet repeat visits quietly slipped month after month. Executives blamed seasonal spending habits. Marketing recommended larger discounts. Consultants proposed more aggressive advertising. Millions of dollars flowed into promotional campaigns designed to attract new customers while quietly losing the old ones. Ethan approved every recommendation because every spreadsheet supported it. Clara never saw those reports, but she recognized the pattern anyway. One evening she served a traveling sales representative wearing a Whitmore Holdings conference badge. He spent an hour complaining to a colleague about empty cafes and disappointing repeat business while absent-mindedly stirring coffee that had long since turned cold. Clara said nothing. She simply listened while refilling their cups. That night she drew another diagram in her notebook. This time she connected circles representing employees instead of customers. Beside them she wrote 3 simple words. People remember people. 2 weeks later, Whitmore Holdings released its quarterly earnings. Revenue had increased, but profits had fallen well below expectations. Analysts asked difficult questions during the earnings call. Why were customer acquisition costs rising so quickly? Why had repeat business weakened across multiple markets? Why were expensive promotions producing smaller returns? Financial reporters described the results as disappointing rather than disastrous, but inside the executive offices the atmosphere changed immediately. Conference rooms that once echoed with confidence became unusually quiet. Ethan stood before a wall of digital charts late one evening, jacket draped across a chair, sleeves rolled neatly above his wrists. Every graph pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. Customers were leaving faster than forecasts predicted. One executive blamed inflation. Another blamed changing consumer habits. A third suggested competitors had become unusually aggressive. Ethan listened without interruption until someone finally whispered, "We did not see this coming." The room fell silent. He walked toward the window overlooking the city. Thousands of lights stretched across the skyline beneath a deep blue evening sky. Reflected in the glass, he caught sight of his own expression. Calm. Controlled. Yet strangely unsettled. Then, without warning, another image surfaced in his memory. A young waitress standing beside a dessert tray. A calm voice saying, "People return because someone remembers them, not because something is discounted." Ethan slowly closed the report in front of him. For the first time in months, he no longer wondered whether Clara Bennett had been bold enough to interrupt a meeting. He wondered whether she had quietly seen something that an entire boardroom had completely missed. Monday mornings inside Whitmore Holdings had always followed the same rhythm. Elevators opened every few seconds. Polished shoes crossed polished marble. Fresh coffee filled conference rooms before sunrise. Confidence moved through the building almost as predictably as the stock ticker glowing across the lobby wall. This Monday felt different. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone sensed it. Quarterly reports lay unopened in front of executives who suddenly found great interest in their own notebooks. Ethan Whitmore entered the boardroom precisely at 8 o'clock carrying nothing except a leather folder and a cup of black coffee that had already cooled during the drive downtown. He did not greet the room. He simply sat down and looked around the table. "Explain it to me," he said quietly. No one answered immediately. The silence lasted nearly 10 seconds before the chief marketing officer cleared his throat. Customer acquisition remained strong. Ethan nodded once. "I did not ask about acquisition." Another executive leaned forward. Brand awareness increased by 14%. Ethan remained expressionless. "I did not ask about awareness." The room became still again. Finally the chief financial officer slid a report across the table. Repeat visits declined another 11%. Ethan opened the report without speaking. Every page confirmed the same uncomfortable story. The company had spent more money attracting strangers than keeping loyal customers. Discounts became deeper. Advertising became louder. Relationships became weaker. He closed the folder slowly. Who approved reducing employee training by 40%? Nobody volunteered an answer. Who decided loyalty programs should become fully automated? More silence. Who recommended replacing experienced store managers with regional algorithms? Eyes drifted toward the far end of the table. Ethan already knew. He had signed every approval himself. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The decisions had looked perfect on paper. Numbers had convinced him that efficiency always defeated familiarity. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, assistants continued answering phones while investors waited for scheduled meetings. Inside, confidence continued disappearing one uncomfortable breath at a time. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The city looked magnificent beneath clear autumn skies. Thousands of people hurried below without realizing billions of dollars could change direction because of one flawed assumption. Behind him someone finally spoke. Customers simply behave differently now. Ethan turned. No. His voice remained calm. Customers still behave exactly like people. The sentence surprised even him. For a brief second the boardroom disappeared from his thoughts. He saw warm restaurant lighting. Crystal glasses. A black apron. A waitress quietly placing dessert on the table before saying something everyone had laughed at. Trust. Not transactions. His assistant entered carefully after knocking once. Sir, your 11 o'clock investor call has been moved. Ethan barely looked up. Cancel the afternoon schedule. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Ethan almost never canceled meetings. Where are you going? One director asked. Ethan picked up his coat. To verify something I should have verified months ago. 35 minutes later a black sedan stopped outside Hawthorne and Ash just before the lunch rush began. Employees near the front windows immediately recognized the familiar vehicle. Conversation spread through the restaurant faster than the aroma of fresh bread. The manager nearly dropped the reservation book while hurrying toward the entrance. Mr. Whitmore. What an honor. We can prepare the private room immediately. Ethan shook his head. I am not here for lunch. His eyes quietly searched the dining room until they found Clara arranging silverware beside a family celebrating a birthday. She laughed softly as a little boy proudly showed her the drawing he had colored on the children's menu. Instead of rushing away, she crouched beside the table long enough to admire every crayon mark as though it deserved museum lighting. The parents smiled. The child beamed. Then Clara returned to work without expecting anything in return. Ethan noticed something no business report had ever measured. The family was already asking when they could come back. The manager followed Ethan's gaze. She is one of our best employees. Ethan answered almost absent-mindedly. I know. Clara looked up and froze for only half a heartbeat before continuing exactly as she had been. She finished delivering coffee to another table, thanked an elderly veteran for his service after noticing the small pin on his jacket, and only then walked toward Ethan with the same quiet composure she had shown 3 months earlier. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. He studied her for a long moment. This time there was no audience. No executives. No laughter. Only the quiet clatter of dishes and the faint ticking of the Swiss watch beneath his sleeve. Miss Bennett, he said evenly, I would like to ask you a question. Clara nodded. All right. Ethan held her gaze. If you had been running my company instead of serving this restaurant, what would you have done differently? The restaurant seemed to grow strangely quieter as Clara considered the question, and for the first time since that rainy evening months before, she realized. The most powerful man she had ever met was no longer asking because he wanted to prove her wrong. He was asking because he genuinely did not know the answer. Clara did not answer immediately. She glanced toward table 14 where an elderly couple had just finished lunch. The husband struggled to stand, so she quietly moved a chair aside before he needed to ask. She smiled, wished them a safe drive home, accepted their gratitude with a simple nod, and only then returned to Ethan Whitmore. "May we sit?" he asked. Clara looked around the dining room. "My break starts in 5 minutes. Ethan checked the time on his watch. "I can wait." The manager, who had been pretending not to watch the conversation from across the room, quickly approached. "Take as much time as you need, Clara." She raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden generosity. 5 minutes later they sat at a small table near the front window instead of the private dining room. Outside, golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk as afternoon sunlight reflected against passing taxis. Clara wrapped both hands around a mug of black coffee that had already begun to cool. Ethan noticed she never added cream or sugar. "You asked what I would have done differently," she said. "Yes. First, I would stop asking why customers leave." Ethan listened carefully. "Then what would you ask? Why employees stop caring?" He leaned back slightly. "Explain." Clara opened her notebook for the first time in front of him. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, hand-drawn diagrams, circles connected by arrows, observations collected over hundreds of quiet evenings. There were no expensive presentation slides. No glossy graphics. Only ideas refined through patience. She turned one page toward him. "People remember faces before logos. If your employees feel invisible, your customers eventually will too." Ethan read silently. Every sentence was surprisingly practical. Small recognition programs. Greater decision-making authority for local managers. Community events instead of endless discounts. Personalized service measured through relationships rather than transactions. Nothing felt revolutionary. Yet together they formed something his consultants had never proposed. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. Clara looked down at the notebook. "Years." "Years?" She nodded. "Every restaurant teaches business if you pay attention." Ethan found himself reading another page. Beside one chart she had written a sentence that immediately caught his attention. "Growth without trust is only speed." He closed the notebook slowly. "Who taught you this?" Clara smiled faintly. "Customers." Ethan almost laughed before realizing she was completely serious. "You never studied business?" "Community college for 2 years." "Why did you stop?" She looked toward the rain beginning to collect on the window. Life became more expensive than tuition. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Finally Ethan reached inside his jacket and removed a simple white business card. There was only his name, a direct phone number, and the Whitmore Holdings logo. He placed it beside her coffee cup. "Come work for me." Clara did not even glance at the card. "Doing what?" "Special advisor." She looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Based on one conversation." "Based on one conversation that predicted a problem my executive team missed." Clara gently slid the card back toward him. "No." Ethan blinked. It had been years since anyone answered him that quickly. "You are declining without hearing the compensation." "Yes." "The salary would likely change your life." Clara smiled politely. "Money changes circumstances. It does not always change direction." Ethan folded his hands. "Then tell me what direction you want." Clara looked around the restaurant. A young server hurried past carrying drinks while nervously apologizing after almost dropping a tray. Clara stood for only a second, steadied the glasses before they tipped, whispered something encouraging, and returned to her seat as though nothing remarkable had happened. "I want to build something," she answered quietly. "Not fix something someone else already built." Ethan studied her expression. There was no arrogance in her voice. Only certainty. "Do you know how difficult that is?" he asked. "Very. Do you know how many companies fail?" "Most of them." "You still believe you can succeed?" Clara looked directly into his eyes. "I believe I can learn." Ethan slowly picked up the business card again but hesitated before putting it away. Instead he turned it over, borrowed her blue pen, and wrote another number beneath the first. "This is my personal line. If you ever change your mind, you call me directly." Clara accepted the card this time, not because she intended to use it, but because refusing it again would have been unnecessary. Ethan stood and adjusted his coat. "Miss Bennet." "Yes." 3 months ago I laughed." Clara nodded once. "I remember. Today I did not." She smiled softly. People change when they listen. Ethan walked toward the exit without another word, but as the restaurant door closed behind him, neither of them noticed a man seated alone near the back corner quietly lowering his newspaper after watching every minute of their conversation. His name was Ryan Mercer, a freelance business consultant with ambitious dreams, sharp instincts, and just enough curiosity to realize that the weathered notebook Clara Bennett carried might be worth far more than anyone in the restaurant had yet imagined. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than expected. Thin white flakes drifted across Manhattan before sunrise, settling briefly on sidewalks already crowded with hurried footsteps and steaming coffee cups. Clara Bennett finished her morning shift just after 10 o'clock and walked toward the public library carrying the same worn notebook inside her shoulder bag. Tuesday mornings had become sacred. The library offered warmth, quiet, and something even more valuable than either. Time to think. She settled into her usual seat beside a tall window overlooking Bryant Park. Around her, students typed assignments while entrepreneurs filled legal pads with dreams they hoped would someday become companies. Clara quietly spread dozens of handwritten pages across the table. During the previous 3 months, her ideas had grown beyond restaurant observations. They had become a complete business philosophy built around one simple belief. People stayed where they felt remembered. She spent 4 uninterrupted hours organizing customer experience models, employee incentive systems, neighborhood partnership strategies, and technology designed to support relationships instead of replacing them. Every page represented another piece of a future no one else could yet imagine. Shortly after 2 o'clock, someone stopped beside her table. "Clara?" She looked up and smiled with pleasant surprise. "Ryan." Ryan Mercer adjusted the messenger bag hanging across his shoulder before extending his hand. Small world. Clara remembered him immediately. He had occasionally worked from Hawthorne and Ash, always ordering black coffee and staying long enough to fill notebooks with business sketches of his own. They had exchanged casual conversations over the past year about books, startups, and the changing economy. Nothing personal. Nothing complicated. Just 2 people who enjoyed asking questions. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Of course." Ryan glanced across the neatly organized pages covering the table. "This looks serious." Clara laughed softly. "It is mostly ideas. Ideas become companies." She hesitated before answering. "Sometimes." Ryan carefully picked up one page after Clara handed it to him voluntarily. He studied it with growing interest. "You built all of this yourself?" "Over several years." "No consultants?" "No." "No investors?" She smiled. "Not yet." Ryan leaned back in genuine admiration. "Clara, this is extraordinary." She thanked him quietly, almost embarrassed by the compliment. They spent the next hour discussing customer loyalty, leadership, and small businesses that succeeded despite limited resources. Ryan asked thoughtful questions. Clara answered openly. She enjoyed conversations with people who listened more than they talked. When the library announced closing time for a private evening event, Clara gathered her papers into careful stacks. Ryan immediately offered to help. Together they organized dozens of handwritten pages inside labeled folders. "You really should digitize all of this," Ryan said. "Paper can disappear." Clara nodded. "I know. I just have not had the time." Ryan reached into his bag and removed a small portable scanner. "Borrow mine for the week." Clara hesitated. "That is generous. So are good ideas." She accepted with sincere gratitude. Before leaving, Ryan handed her a business card. "If you ever decide to build this, call me. I know developers, designers, investors. I would love to help." Clara slipped the card into her notebook beside Ethan Whitmore's. As she walked home beneath softly falling snow, she realized something had quietly changed. Months earlier she had believed in her ideas alone. Now two very different businessmen believed in them as well. Across town, Ryan did not drive home immediately. Instead he parked beside the Hudson River, opened his laptop, and sat in thoughtful silence. Clara's handwritten models occupied his mind with startling clarity. The elegance of the system. The simplicity. The practicality. He had spent years searching for an idea capable of attracting serious investors. Suddenly one had appeared inside a public library carried by a waitress who had no patents, no legal protections, and no business entity. Ryan stared through the windshield while snowflakes collected along the wipers. He did not think of himself as dishonest. He simply convinced himself that ideas belonged to whoever could execute them first. Back in her apartment, Clara carefully placed every folder inside an old storage box beneath her desk before making tea and opening the portable scanner Ryan had loaned her. A notification appeared on her aging laptop announcing that the device could automatically upload scanned files to secure cloud storage. She smiled with relief. For the first time, years of work finally seemed protected. What Clara did not notice was the tiny default setting buried deep inside the software installation. Automatic shared workspace enabled. She clicked accept without a second thought, unaware that somewhere else in the city another screen quietly came to life as the first pages of her life's work began appearing one file at a time in a folder that did not belong to her. The following Friday began like any other. Clara Bennett arrived before sunrise, tied her apron with practiced hands, and greeted the bakery delivery driver by name before helping him carry two heavy boxes through the back entrance even though it was not part of her job. The kitchen staff thanked her without thinking. They had grown accustomed to small kindnesses that never asked for recognition. By noon the restaurant buzzed with conversations, birthday celebrations, business lunches, and the familiar rhythm of dishes meeting polished tables. Clara moved through it all with quiet precision, noticing empty water glasses before guests reached for them and remembering favorite meals without needing to ask. Around 3 in the afternoon her phone vibrated inside her apron. She ignored it until her break. Then another notification appeared. And another. Curious, she stepped outside beneath a pale winter sky and unlocked the screen. A business news headline filled the display. Former consultant announces revolutionary customer loyalty platform. Clara frowned. She opened the article. A photograph appeared first. Ryan Mercer stood on a brightly lit stage beside a newly unveiled company logo while reporters surrounded him with microphones. She continued reading. Every sentence made her breathing slower. The article described a relationship-first operating model. Community-driven customer engagement. Employee empowerment. Personalized neighborhood experiences. Even the phrase growth without trust echoed through the presentation, only slightly rewritten. Clara read the paragraph twice before lowering the phone. The cold air suddenly felt much sharper. She did not cry. She did not panic. She simply stood still while traffic rolled past the restaurant. A server opened the back door. "Clara, are you okay?" She looked up with the same calm expression she always carried. "Yes." The answer surprised even her. She finished the remainder of her shift exactly as she always had. Guests never noticed anything different. She smiled. She served coffee. She thanked customers for coming. Only after locking her apartment door that evening did she remove every folder from beneath her desk. She compared her handwritten pages with screenshots from Ryan's company website. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Entire frameworks matched. Diagrams had become polished graphics. Even examples she had casually discussed in the library appeared inside promotional material. Clara slowly closed the laptop. The room became very quiet except for the ticking of the inexpensive wall clock above her kitchen table. She reached for Ethan Whitmore's business card, turning it between her fingers before placing it back down. Calling him would be easy. Explaining everything would be easy. Fighting would be easy. She did none of those things. Instead she opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote one sentence. "If someone can copy my map, they cannot copy the place I discovered." Across the city Ryan stood inside a modern co-working space accepting congratulations from investors impressed by his overnight momentum. Venture capital meetings filled his calendar. Interviews followed. Every compliment made him smile a little wider, yet each celebration lasted only moments before a strange discomfort quietly returned. During one interview a reporter asked, "Where did the original inspiration come from?" Ryan hesitated for the first time all day. "Years of observation," he answered carefully. It was not entirely false. It simply was not the whole truth. Meanwhile Ethan Whitmore reviewed startup news while waiting for another board meeting to begin. Ryan's announcement caught his attention because the philosophy sounded oddly familiar. He opened the presentation. By the third slide he stopped reading financial projections and started reading sentences. Relationship before transaction. Employees create loyalty before marketing does. His eyes narrowed. He had heard ideas like these before, but not from a consultant standing beneath television lights. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and found the weathered business card copy where he had written his private phone number months earlier. Beside it rested a folded restaurant receipt from Hawthorne and Ash. Ethan stared at both for several silent seconds before pressing the intercom. "Emily." "Yes, sir." "Cancel my next appointment." "Certainly." "And find everything you can about Ryan Mercer." Outside his office. Window. The afternoon sun disappeared behind gathering clouds. Somewhere across Manhattan Clara Bennett sat alone beside a cold cup of untouched coffee, filling another blank page with fresh ideas instead of dwelling on stolen ones, unaware that the man who had once laughed at her was beginning to suspect that the greatest mistake in the room had never been hers at all. Winter settled over Manhattan with quiet determination. Snow gathered along sidewalks before the city swept it away each morning, just as yesterday's headlines disappeared beneath today's successes. Ryan Mercer's company dominated every business publication. Investors praised his vision. Podcasts invited him to discuss the future of customer loyalty. Television hosts called him one of the brightest entrepreneurs of the year. Clara Bennett watched none of it. She had already made a decision that no headline could change. Instead of chasing what had been taken from her, she would build something that could never be stolen again. Every evening after finishing her shifts at Hawthorne and Ash, she rented a small desk inside a shared workspace above an old bookstore in Brooklyn. The office contained mismatched chairs, unreliable heating, and windows that rattled whenever the subway passed below, but to Clara it felt like possibility. She covered one wall with handwritten notes instead of motivational posters. At the center she pinned a single sentence. "Build what only experience can teach." She no longer designed software around customer loyalty alone. She redesigned the entire relationship between businesses, employees, and neighborhoods. Every recommendation would evolve continuously through real interactions instead of static formulas. Every location would become unique because every community was unique. No consultant could duplicate that with copied documents alone. One snowy evening, a young software engineer named Daniel Cho wandered past her desk carrying a laptop and 2 cups of coffee. He stopped after noticing dozens of diagrams taped across the wall. "Did you create all of this?" Clara smiled. "I am trying to." Daniel studied the sketches for several quiet moments before placing one coffee beside her keyboard. "This solves problems I have been struggling with for months." Clara thanked him. They spent the next 2 hours exchanging ideas instead of resumes. Daniel challenged assumptions without dismissing them. Clara welcomed every difficult question. By midnight they had outlined the first working prototype. 2 days later another member of the shared workspace joined them. Then another. None of them came because of salaries. There were none. They came because Clara listened before she led. She never claimed to know every answer. She simply asked better questions than anyone else. Across the river, Ryan celebrated another funding round worth nearly $60 million. Champagne glasses filled conference rooms while cameras captured smiling executives shaking hands beneath bright lights. Yet beneath the celebration, small cracks quietly appeared. Early pilot locations reported that customers enjoyed the new technology during the first few weeks but gradually stopped using it. Store managers complained the system felt impersonal. Employees followed automated recommendations without understanding the people standing in front of them. Investors dismissed the concerns as temporary growing pains. Ryan accepted that explanation because he wanted to believe it himself. At Whitmore Holdings, Ethan reviewed confidential market reports that arrived every Monday before sunrise. One report caught his attention immediately. Ryan's platform generated impressive enrollment numbers but unusually weak long-term engagement. Ethan leaned back slowly. The pattern looked painfully familiar. Different company. Same mistake. Measuring transactions instead of trust. He closed the report and looked toward the snow drifting outside his office windows. Emily entered carrying the latest research his team had completed on Ryan Mercer. "There is something else," she said carefully. Several former colleagues describe him as ambitious, but they all mentioned one unusual detail. Ethan looked up. "Go on." None of them could explain where his core business philosophy originally came from. They only said it appeared almost overnight. Ethan remained silent. A memory surfaced. With startling clarity. Clara's weathered notebook resting beside a cooling cup of coffee. Handwritten circles. Handwritten arrows. Ideas developed long before anyone else noticed them. That evening he drove past Hawthorne and Ash without planning to stop. The restaurant windows glowed warmly against the cold street, but Clara was not inside. Curious, he parked across the block and walked in anyway. The manager recognized him immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan nodded politely. "Is Clara working tonight?" The manager smiled with quiet pride. "Not anymore." Ethan paused. "She resigned last week. Do you know where she went?" The manager glanced toward the empty table where Clara used to organize silverware before every shift. "She said she was finally ready to build something." Ethan thanked him and stepped back outside. Snowflakes settled across the shoulders of his dark coat as he stood beneath the streetlight listening to the city breathe around him. Somewhere beyond the crowded avenues and glowing office towers, a former waitress was building a future from scratch with nothing except ideas, patience, and people who believed in her. For reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks. He had once believed the most valuable assets in business were capital and timing. Standing alone beneath the falling snow, he began to understand that the rarest asset of all was a person who could lose everything on paper and still create something no one else had imagined. Spring arrived almost unnoticed. The last traces of snow disappeared from the sidewalks, replaced by flowering trees and longer evenings that painted Manhattan in warm shades of gold. 1 year had passed since Clara Bennett quietly walked away from Hawthorne and Ash carrying nothing except a notebook, a borrowed laptop, and an idea that had already been underestimated twice. Now the shared workspace above the old bookstore had become the headquarters of a growing company called Heartwarming. There were still no marble floors. No private elevators. No executive dining rooms. Employees shared long wooden tables, brewed their own coffee, and greeted one another by first name every morning. Every new hire spent their first day visiting neighborhood businesses instead of conference rooms because Clara believed understanding people came before understanding spreadsheets. The company expanded carefully, one community at a time, refusing investors who demanded impossible growth at the expense of trust. Customers noticed. Employees stayed. Local businesses recommended the platform to one another without expensive advertising. Success spread quietly, almost the same way kindness had once spread through a restaurant dining room. Across the city, Ryan Mercer's company struggled beneath growing pressure. Investors demanded explanations for declining retention rates and frustrated clients. The copied ideas had produced impressive headlines but shallow roots. During one tense board meeting, a director asked the question Ryan had dreaded for months. What happens after the first impression? Ryan searched for an answer that never came. He finally understood the truth Clara had written long before he ever saw her notebook. You could copy a system. You could not copy the years of observation that allowed it to keep evolving. Meanwhile, Whitmore Holdings recovered steadily after Ethan reversed many of the decisions that had weakened the company. Experienced managers regained authority. Employee training returned. Local communities mattered again. Quarterly reports slowly improved, but Ethan rarely measured success the way he once had. Every month he visited one neighborhood business without announcing himself, sitting quietly with owners and employees, listening far more than speaking. The lesson had cost millions of dollars, but it had changed him in ways no balance sheet could measure. In early October, the National Business Leadership Forum invited entrepreneurs from across the country to speak about the future of American business. Hundreds of executives gathered beneath enormous chandeliers inside one of New York City's most prestigious hotels. Television cameras lined the back of the ballroom. Journalists filled every seat. Ethan Whitmore delivered the keynote address just before the closing ceremony. As always, he spoke without notes. He discussed leadership, responsibility, and the danger of believing success made people infallible. Then he paused. The room became perfectly still. Several years ago, he said calmly, I laughed at someone because I believed position determined wisdom. Curious smiles appeared throughout the audience. Ethan continued. I was wrong. Behind him, a large screen displayed the names of this year's Innovation Award finalists. The final name appeared last. Clara Bennett. Heartwarming. A wave of applause swept through the ballroom as Clara walked toward the stage wearing a simple navy suit instead of designer labels. She carried herself exactly as she had carried trays through Hawthorne and Ash. Calm. Unhurried. Fully present. Ethan stepped away from the podium before she reached it. Instead of offering a formal handshake, he applauded first. Alone. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. One pair of hands became 10. 10 became 100. Within seconds every person in the room had risen to their feet. The standing ovation lasted so long that the television producers quietly abandoned the scheduled music. Clara accepted the award with both hands before looking across the audience. People often ask how this company began, she said softly. They expect me to describe a perfect business plan. The truth is much simpler. It began by paying attention when everyone else was too busy proving they already had the answers. Gentle laughter filled the room. She smiled. Ideas matter. Hard work matters. But the greatest opportunities often arrive disguised as ordinary conversations with ordinary people. If we stop listening because someone wears an apron instead of a tailored suit, we might miss the person capable of changing an entire industry. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before smiling to himself. Those words carried no bitterness. Only quiet wisdom. After the ceremony ended, reporters surrounded Clara with questions while photographers captured every handshake and every smile. Ethan waited until the crowd finally thinned before approaching her. "Congratulations," he said. Clara thanked him warmly. He looked toward the award in her hands before meeting her eyes. "You built something I wish I had imagined first." Clara smiled with the same calm confidence she had carried since the day they met. "You helped me more than you know." Ethan looked surprised. "By laughing?" She nodded gently. "Sometimes the door that closes is the one that finally points us toward the right road." They stood together beside the tall hotel windows as evening lights reflected across the city they had both changed in different ways. Outside, people hurried home carrying groceries, briefcases, backpacks, and dreams invisible to everyone around them. Inside, neither success nor failure seemed quite as important as the lesson left behind. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.